Always with Honor. Written by Pyotr Wrangel. Part 1. The Birth of the Counter-Revolution. Chapter 1. The Revolution and the Collapse of the Army. On the verge. Towards the winter of 1916, the bloody struggles which had been waged throughout the summer and autumn drew to a close. We consolidated our position, filled in the gaps in our effective forces, and reorganized generally. The experience gained from 2 years of warfare had not been acquired in vain. We had learnt a great deal, and the shortcomings for which we had paid so dearly were now discounted. A number of generals who had not kept pace with modern needs had had to give up their commands, and life had brought other more capable men to the fore. But nepotism, which permeated all spheres of Russian life, still brought unworthy men into important positions too often. Convention, routine, and fear of disregarding the custom of promotion by seniority still held sway, especially amongst the higher military staff. After 2 years of warfare, the army was not what it had been. The majority of the original officers and men, especially in the infantry, had been killed or put out of action. The new officers, hastily trained and lacking military education and esprit de corps, could not make satisfactory instructors for the men. They knew how to die bravely for the honor of their country and their flag, like all the staff officers, but they felt that they had been uprooted from their normal and anything but military work and had neither the mentality nor the spirit of the true soldier. They found difficulty in enduring the dangers, fatigue, and privations of life at the front, and war to them meant nothing but suffering. It was impossible for them to inspire the troops and put fresh heart into their men. Neither were the troops what they had been. The original soldiers, inured to fatigue and privation and brave in battle, were better than ever, but there were few of them left. The new contingents were by no means satisfactory. The reserve forces were primarily fathers of families who had been dragged away from then villages and were warriors only in spite of themselves. For they had forgotten that once upon a time they had been soldiers, they hated war, and thought only of returning to their homes as soon as possible. Before they were sent to the front, these men were passed through the cadres and given some preliminary training, but it was very inadequate. There were not enough cadres, and the barracks allotted to them were too small to house all the men. Furthermore, the instructors, both commissioned and non-commissioned officers, were not up to then work. They were either disabled and worn out from active service, or else very young officers who themselves had much to learn. The infantry, whose losses were heaviest of any, suffered most from this arrangement. But nevertheless, in spite of everything, the army was still strong and impressive. The morale of the troops was excellent, and the discipline perfect. I never once saw or even heard of the slightest expression of disaffection or disorder. Indeed, before this could happen, the very idea of authority had to disappear, and the generals themselves had to set the example of breaking the bonds of loyalty which existed between officers and men. It is obvious that after 2 years of warfare, the moral standards of the army could not but have slackened, and respect for the law diminished. Requisitioning, an inevitable consequence of any war, had lessened the soldiers' regard for other people's property. Base instincts were aroused, but I repeat that they would not have been set in motion but for an external shock. A great deal of work was being done, especially in the wake of the army, behind the lines, by a numerous class of people which was on the increase during these last months. The individuals of this class had been mobilized and were in perfect health, but they had an unconquerable aversion from the endless whining of bullets and the bursting of shells. And so, secure in the protection and support of a quieter atmosphere, they sat on all kinds of committees and occupied themselves with the organization of reading rooms and canteens for the trenches. These men, dressed in absurd uniforms, all spurted and laced, took great pains with the main body of the army, especially the ensigns, for the staff and soldiers of the technical units were recruited from amongst the intelligentsia. Most of the army, rank and file as well as officers, took no part at all in politics. They had other things to do, and besides, they lacked newspapers and information. One party amongst the officers echoed the gossip of the neighboring general staff. They believed that general headquarters were au courant with events in the country, and prophesied that the disorder in the interior would finally react on the army and so lead to its defeat. We continually told one another that things would not come to this pass in Petersburg. Those of us who loved our country and the army were terribly anxious at the continual changes in the ministry, the conflicts between the government and the Duma, the ever-increasing number of petitions and appeals addressed to the Tsar by many influential organizations, each one demanding popular control, and above all, by the alarming rumors concerning certain persons in the Tsar's entourage. The patriots amongst the high command suffered deeply as they watched the Tsar making fatal mistakes whilst the danger grew and came ever nearer. They held mistaken views, but they believed in them sincerely. They contemplated the possibility of a revolution from within the palace to be effected by means of a bloodless coup d'etat. General Krimov, my immediate superior, was one of those who was strongly in favor of this plan. He was commander of a division of Usurian Cossacks, in which I commanded a regiment of Nerchinsk Cossacks. During the long discussions we had on many an evening, he tried again and again to prove to me that things could not go on as they were, that we must prevent a catastrophe, and that we ought to find men who, without a day's delay, would remove the Tsar by means of a revolution from within the palace. There were other commanders who also agreed that things could not go on as they were, but they realized how inopportune a change in time of war would be, and saw that it would inevitably entail the collapse of the army and the ruin of the country. Others, again, desired a revolution for purely personal reasons, hoping to find in it scope for their ambitions, or to profit from it and settle their accounts with such of the commanders as they hated. I am firmly convinced that if, from the beginning of the revolutionary movement, headquarters and the generals at the front had forgotten their personal interests and acted unanimously and resolutely, the army would not have collapsed, nor the interior fallen prey to anarchy, or at least that things would have been checked in time. The Tsarevich's regiment of Nerchinsk Cossacks, which I commanded during the winter of 1916, was part of a division of Usurian Cossacks. This division, recruited from eastern Siberia, enjoyed a high reputation in the army. It had covered itself with glory many times, and recently my regiment had been signally rewarded for distinguished conduct in Galicia. His Majesty had appointed his son honorary commander of the regiment, which was henceforth known as the Tsarevich's own. During the Civil War, the majority of the officers of the Usurian division, and of the Nerchinsk regiment in particular, were in Admiral Kolchak's army, and met again under the command of Ataman Semenov and General Ungern. At the time of which I am speaking, these two generals, who have since played such a prominent part in the Civil War, were captains of the 5th and 6th squadrons of the Nerchinsk regiment. Semenov was a Transbaikalian Cossack, dark and thickset, and of the rather alert Mongolian type. His intelligence was of a specifically Cossack caliber, and he was an exemplary soldier, especially courageous when under the eye of his superior. He knew how to make himself popular with Cossacks and officers alike, but he had his weaknesses, a love of intrigue and indifference to the means by which he achieved his ends. Though capable and ingenious, he had received no education, and his outlook was narrow. I have never been able to understand how he came to play a leading role. Captain Baron Ungern Stenberg, or simply the Baron, as his troops called him, was more complex and interesting. He was of the type that is invaluable in wartime and impossible in times of peace. At the beginning of the Russo-Japanese War, though still almost a child, he had left school and joined up as a volunteer in an infantry regiment. He was wounded many times and was decorated. After the war, he went back to Russia, where his relatives made him enter a military school. He passed his officer's examinations only with great difficulty. Longing for adventure and feeling out of his element in the regular army, he set out for Siberia and joined a Cossack regiment. He did not remain with it long. One night, in a fit of drunken anger, he picked a petty quarrel with one of his comrades and struck him. The man dealt him a sword blow on his head, and he felt the effects of this wound for the rest of his life. It undoubtedly upset his mental balance. He returned to Russia and decided to travel from Vladivostok to Karbin on horseback. He left his regiment, swung himself into the saddle, whistled to his dog, and set off with a fowling piece slung over his shoulder. Hunting for his food and sleeping in the open air, he took a whole year to reach Karbin. There he learned that war had just broken out between the Chinese and the Mongols. He remounted his horse, pushed on to Mongolia, and offered his services, and there he was, commander of the whole cavalry force of Mongolia. At the outbreak of the World War, he came back to Russia and joined up as sub-lieutenant in the Nerchinsk regiment. From the first, he won distinction by his courageous exploits. He was wounded many times and decorated with the St. George's Cross, the highest honor a soldier can win, and by the end of the year, he was a captain and in command of the squadron. He was of medium height, fair and puny-looking, with a long reddish mustache, but he possessed an iron constitution and ruthless energy. War was his natural element. He was not an officer in the ordinary sense. He knew nothing of system, turned up his nose at discipline, and was ignorant of the rudiments of decency and decorum. He was not an officer, but a hero out of one of Mayne Reid's novels. He was dirty and dressed untidily, slept on the floor with his Cossacks, and messed with them. When he was promoted to a civilized environment, his lack of all outward refinement made him conspicuous. I tried in vain to awaken his conscience to the need for adopting at least the external appearance of an officer. He was a man of queer contrasts. He had an original, penetrating mind, but at the same time an astonishing lack of culture, an extremely narrow outlook, the shyness of the savage, a foolish swagger, and an unbridled temper. He was very extravagant, though his means were exceptionally small. In accordance with an old custom, we had to offer the new honorary commander a horse and the uniform of the regiment which was to bear his name. Consequently, I left for the capital at the head of a deputation from the regiment, taking with me a small Majorian horse just big enough for the young Tsarevich. Scarcely 2 months before this, I had been in Petersburg, recovering from a wound. I had got it in the famous charge which had earned us the signal honor, which was the cause of my returning to Petersburg today. Confusion was rife in all circles. There seemed to be a presentiment abroad of the nearness of the terrible events which destiny was preparing for Russia. In the Duma and the Imperial Council and in different political groups, a pretense of stern authority was reduced to a matter of public speaking matches and political debates, while in artisan circles and urban associations there was subterranean propaganda at work, fed no doubt by Germans. Yet, at the same time, the majority of the population remained absorbed in its little daily cares. The queues lined up outside the shops, the theaters and cinemas were full, and the same old trivial conversations were to be overheard in the crowd. Court circles appeared to be paying no heed to the approaching storm. High society and the upper bureaucracy remained absorbed in their usual weighty questions, such as the appointment of someone to some post, or the opinions held by the Grand Duke's or the Empress's party. Social life followed its usual course, and it seemed as if these people were merely to be the spectators and not the victims of the drama to come. Some days after my arrival, I entered the service of the Tsar as his aide-de-camp. I have had many opportunities of meeting the Tsar and chatting with him. He produced an impression of extraordinary simplicity and unusual kindliness on everyone who met him, the result of the outstanding traits of his character, his perfect education, and his complete self-mastery. He had an alert mind, was skilled in the art of innuendo, and possessed an amazing memory. He remembered not only events, but names and dates. One day, he spoke to me of the battles in which my regiment had taken part. Although it was a long time ago and we had done nothing noteworthy, he even mentioned the villages in which the regiments of our division had been quartered. I began my service as aide-de-camp to the Tsar one Saturday, relieving Duke Nicholas of Leuchtenberg. That day dinner was served in the Empress's apartments. There were only the Imperial family and myself at table. Their Majesties kept me part of the evening for a chat. The Tsar was merry and vivacious. The Grand Duchesses and the Tsarevich laughed together, and exchanged badinage, but I was struck by the expression of suffering on the Empress's face. She had grown much thinner in the 2 months since I had last seen her, and I particularly noticed the expression in her eyes. It was sad, I might say absent-minded. She was especially interested in the organization of medical relief in the army, and also asked me detailed questions about the new type of gas mask. The next day being Sunday, I accompanied their majesties to church. The little temple, built in the old Russian style, was packed. Watching the imperial couple at prayer, I involuntarily compared the Tsar's expression of pious contemplation with the Empress's look of sorrowful ecstasy. Some days later, I presented the deputation from my regiment to His Majesty. I little dreamt that this was the last time I was to see the Tsar. 2. On the Romanian front. That same evening, I received a telegram from General Krimov. Our division was to leave for Romania, so I was to rejoin my regiment immediately, taking back with me all the officers and men on leave in Petersburg. We left the next day. As far as the Romanian frontier, the trains were running much as usual, but across the frontier things were very different. The Romanian troops were retreating, and the line was blocked by trains full of refugees, wounded, and munitions. I saw for the first time what I saw daily after this: passengers sitting on the roofs of the carriages, on the buffers, and even on the engines. At a branch line not far from the terminus, our 2 carriages were hooked on to an express. So that we might have more chance of keeping warm, I had with great difficulty extracted a promise that we should be put on at the front of the train. I do not know how it happened, but they hooked us on at the back after all. This saved our lives. Dashing along at full speed, our train crashed into a train in front of us, and the first 14 carriages were wrecked. There were several hundred killed and injured. We found our division on the march, making for the line of the Sereth, from where we were to make for Galatz, where great masses of cavalry were to be concentrated. Then came a counter-order, and we retraced our steps through driving rain, soaked to the skin. During the march, an orderly came to inform me that General Krimov, who was marching at the head of our column, wanted me. I found him with our general staff near a wood house, busily reading a letter which had just come. Whilst I was still some way off, he called out to me, "Great news! At last they've killed that scoundrel Rasputin." The newspapers announced the bare fact. Letters from the capital gave the details. Of the 3 assassins, I knew 2 intimately: the Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich and Prince Yusupov. What had been their motive? Why, having killed a man whom they regarded as a menace to the country, had they not admitted their action before everyone? Why had they not relied on justice and public opinion instead of trying to hide all trace of the murder by burying the body under the ice? We thought over the news with great anxiety. In the first days of 1917, I was made commander of the brigade of which my old Nerchinsk regiment was a part. I was genuinely sorry to part from my gallant comrades in arms with whom I had shared victory, fatigue, and danger for 14 months. As my brigade was stationed behind the lines for the time being, I took the opportunity to spend a few days in Jassy. I stayed with Mosolov, our minister resident there, an old fellow officer of mine. The town was full of refugees and behind-the-line organizations, and it was almost impossible to find lodgings. They were expecting the Grand Duchess Cyril, the Queen of Romania's sister. Never having belonged to the Grand Duchess's intimate circle, I refrained from calling on her to pay my respects. But on the very day of my arrival, the court Marshal M. Hartung called to inform me that the Grand Duchess expected me the next day at 10 o'clock at the Queen's palace. They had not been able to find a building in Jassy roomy enough to house the entire royal family of Romania, so the Queen and her children were living in one house, the King in another. At the Grand Duchess's, I met the commander of the town, General Kasakovich, formerly aide-de-camp to the Tsar. The Grand Duchess kept us for more than an hour. She gave me details of all the latest events in Petersburg, of the arrest and banishment to Persia of the Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, of the joint letter which all the members of the Imperial family had sent to the Tsar, begging for mercy for the Grand Duke, of the Tsar's refusal, and of the disgrace of the Grand Duke Nicholas Mikhailovich, because he had sent a violent letter to the Tsar in which he had given expression to certain bitter truths. According to the Grand Duchess, all the members of the imperial family, even the Tsar's closest relations, realized very clearly the danger that was threatening the dynasty and the whole of Russia. The Tsarina alone could not or would not see it. Her sister, the Grand Duchess Elizabeth, the Grand Duchess Cyril herself, and Princess Yusupov, the mother of Rasputin's murderer, had all tried in vain to open her eyes. I know Russia better than you do, and I have known it much longer. Besides, there is a Russia whose existence you do not even realize. You only hear what is said in Petersburg in corrupt, aristocratic circles. They are not speaking for the people. If you had been with the Tsar and myself at the front, you would have seen how the people and the army adore him. The Tsarina had opened a drawer, taken out a bundle of letters, and shown them to the Grand Duchess. All these letters are from officers and soldiers, simple Russian men. I receive a similar pile every day. They all adore the Emperor and beg him not to yield an inch to the intrigues of the Duma. The Grand Duchess gave us to understand that the majority of the members of the imperial family, especially the family of the Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, mother of the Grand Duke Cyril, considered it necessary to modify the existing order of things, and that many influential members of the Duma shared this view. This long interview with the Grand Duchess Cyril left a painful impression on my mind. I had met her many times in Petersburg, but I had never been one of her circle. Her desire to see me and the confidences with which she had honored me seemed to me a trifle unusual. Subsequent events and the part that the Grand Duke Cyril played at the head of the revolutionary Marines of the Guard in the first days of the revolution perhaps explain many things. 1. The following day, I was invited to dine with the Queen of Romania, who placed me beside her at the table and was as charming as she is beautiful. Fortunately, no one reopened the subject of events in Petersburg. On my return to the embassy, I found a telegram informing me that I had been promoted to the rank of general. As our divisional general was ill, I was to deputize for him. The same evening, I left to rejoin the army. At the end of January, we received orders to present ourselves at Kishinev. Bessarabia is a very fertile country. Provisions and provender were plentiful, and at last, our troops could obtain all they needed. We marched by long stages. The winter was very severe, and we had heavy snowfalls. This made the march doubly laborious, but our Transbaikalian horses were used to such conditions, and we arrived speedily and without excessive discomfort. The pretty little town of Kishinev, usually so quiet and sleepy, was unrecognizable. It was humming with life. Our division, Count Keller's cavalry corps, and Prince Bagration's division were quartered in the town itself or in the nearest suburbs. The theaters and restaurants, too, were full of officers of Cossack and cavalry regiments. The nobility, the municipality, and the merchants vied with one another in making us welcome. Dinners, balls, and tea dances followed one another in rapid succession, and the officers, who had been deprived of all these things for the last 2 years, gave themselves up to gaiety wholeheartedly. The hardships of the winter were forgotten, and we were far from foreseeing the horrors of the morrow. 3. At the front and in the interior during the revolution. Our divisional headquarters were 18 versts from Kishinev, but we had a modest pied-à-terre in the town itself. When General Krimov returned and had settled down there, I went back to headquarters. At the beginning of March, rumors of trouble in Petersburg were going round the town. There was talk of strikes, disturbances, and risings. But as all the rumors were extremely vague, we paid very little attention to them. On March 4th or 5th, about 8 o'clock in the evening, I was having supper quietly at home when General Krimov telephoned me. I gathered from his tone of voice that something serious had happened. He said, "The revolution has broken out in Petersburg, and the Tsar has abdicated. I am going to read you his manifesto and that of his successor, the Grand Duke Michael III. Tomorrow, the troops must be told." I begged the general to wait a moment and fetch the chief of our general staff. As Krimov spoke, he wrote down the text. The general finished reading the Tsar's manifesto and began on the Grand Duke Michael's. At the first words, I said to the chief of the general staff, "This is the end of everything. This is anarchy." Certainly, the very fact of the Tsar's abdication, even though it was provoked by social discontent, would absolutely stagger the people and the army. But this was not all. The danger lay in the destruction of the monarchical idea and the disappearance of the monarch. During the last few years, many loyal hearts had become alienated from the Tsar. The army as well as the country realized that he had endangered his throne by his own actions. If he had abdicated in favor of his son or his brother, such an act would not have roused much painful feeling in the country. The Russian people would have sworn allegiance to the new Tsar and continued to serve him and their country to the death, as they had always done, for the faith, the Tsar, and the homeland. But in the present circumstances, with the disappearance of the Tsar, the very idea of authority and all the age-old obligations vanished, and nothing could take the place of either in the minds of the Russian people. What the officers and the Russian soldiers must have felt, brought up on the monarchic principle and loyal in their allegiance to the Tsar, they had acted on their principles all their lives and saw the chief meaning of the war in them. I must admit that the High Command remained absolutely passive, doing nothing to help the army through this crisis, to keep up the spirits of the troops, or to make them realize their duty. They issued no orders, and each general had to do what he thought was for the best. One or two stupid things were done. One colonel of an infantry regiment could find nothing more intelligent to say to his men than that the Tsar had gone mad. I decided to communicate the two manifestos to the soldiers and to explain things as I saw them myself. I informed them of the disturbances in the interior and of the general discontent, a natural result of the abuses committed by the officials who had duped the Tsar or who had been too incompetent to do their duty and to cope with the difficulties of the war. I told them I did not know why the Tsar had considered it necessary to abdicate, but here were the manifestos of the Tsar and the Grand Duke, the will of the Tsar, to whom we had sworn allegiance, and that of his successor ought to be sacred to us, and since he commanded us to obey and be loyal to the provisional government, our duty was to do so. In the morning, the two manifestos were read to the regiments. The first impression can be described in one word: stupefaction. It was a staggering blow. Officers and men were dumbfounded and could scarcely pull themselves together. For some days the camp was gloomy, everyone trying to understand what had happened. Only in the units where the intellectuals were leaders, and especially behind the lines, ambulances, depots, etc., cheerfulness reigned supreme, and the new regime was celebrated joyfully. The crisis safely over, I went along to see General Krimov. He took an optimistic view of things, believing that we were on the eve of a renaissance and not of a disaster. The town was already given over to popular political meetings. Groups of people were marching about under the red flag. At the crossroads, orators sprung from goodness knows where were haranguing the people. But the general continued to be optimistic. He was convinced that the army would keep out of politics altogether, and said that since a change of government was inevitable, it was better that it should happen now and not after the demobilization. Then the army could return, weapons in hand, to dictate the law of the land in its own way. He told me the names of the members of the provisional government. Gauchkov, the Minister of War, was the only one who had any idea of the needs of the army. He had been at the head of the Red Cross during the Russo-Japanese War and president of the Committee for National Defense in the Duma. Now he was chairman of the Technical Revictualling Committee. Krimov, who knew him intimately, had full confidence in him. Nevertheless, the appointment of a civilian to the post of Minister of War in the middle of a campaign was a risky proceeding. "Yes," Krimov said to me, "he is a real statesman, and furthermore, he knows as much about the army as you and I do. You will see how things go. He is not to be compared with those damned old routine mongers who have spent their whole lives in ministries. He is worth the whole lot of them put together." The head of the government, Prince Lvov, had been president of the United Zemstvos.5. He was reputed to be a staunch patriot and an honest man. Milyukov and Chingarev had been eloquent leaders of the opposition, But of the rest, Tereshchenko, Nekrasov, and the others, we knew little or nothing. We were justified in doubting whether the necessary men capable of taking the power into their hands were to be found amongst them. The general gave me the newspapers which had just arrived from Petersburg. They were scarcely reassuring. It was clear that the government was already drifting from its original course, taken in tow by the Soviet of the deputies of the workmen and soldiers. I was especially angry to hear for the first time that soldiers and officers would end by understanding one another, and officers would be forced to respect the soldiers who were men like themselves. This humbug was not only repeated by nobodies, but by such men as M. Milyukov in his speech at the Tauride Palace on March 2nd. My fears were only too well founded. The provisional government's first measures showed that the disorder in the interior had gone too far to be suppressed, and that these incompetent men, strangers to the army, could do nothing to prevent things from going to ruin. One morning, Krimov telephoned me, saying, "Get together whatever you need for a few days' absence. You must leave today for Petersburg. Come over here, and I will tell you what it is all about." An hour later, I was in Kishinev. I found the general in his shirt sleeves and lead breeches, surrounded by crumpled newspapers which were torn to pieces and trampled underfoot. He was beside himself. "Read that," he said, thrusting a newspaper into my hands. "They have lost their heads. God knows what is happening there. I cannot believe that this is really Gauchkov. How can he allow those scoundrels to touch the army? I have written to him. I cannot leave my division without the permission of my immediate superior. You can go, because I am your superior and I give you permission. Go to Petersburg and see Gauchkov." He began to read his letter to me. In words expressive of sorrow and the deepest indignation, he drew attention to the danger that threatened the army and the whole of Russia with it. The army ought to remain outside politics altogether, and all those who meddled with it were committing a crime against their country. In the middle of loading the letter, he clasped his head in his hands and burst into sobs. The letter ended by begging the minister to regard everything that I said as coming from himself. The same evening, I left for Petersburg. On the way, at one of the stations, we met an express coming from the north. General Baron Mannerheim, who later commanded the White Army in Finland, was on it. He was the first eyewitness to give me details of the popular risings in the capital, the treason of the troops, and the murder of officers which had been going on since the beginning of the revolution. Baron Mannerheim himself had been forced to hide for 3 days, slipping from one lodging to another. Amongst the victims of the frenzied mob and the soldiery were a number of my friends. Old Count Stackelberg, Count Mengden, formerly a colonel in the Horse Guards, Count Klenmischel, a hussar of the guard, and others too. The two last mentioned had been murdered at Luga by their own soldiers, reservists of the guard. Whilst waiting for out-connection at Kiev, we visited the town. The statue of Stolypin had been knocked down and several houses sacked. It was here that I first heard people praising Kerensky. His admirers believed that he was the only member of the government with any control over the populace. They said it was he who had put an end to the massacres which had begun in the first days of the revolution. At Bakhmach, Colonel Count Mengden got into the train. He was the brother of the Mengden who had just been assassinated, an aide-de-camp to the Grand Duke Nicholas, whom the Tsar had appointed generalissimo when he himself had abdicated. He told us he had just left the Grand Duke, who had already been advised that the provisional government desired him to give up his command to General Alexeyev. The Grand Duke had decided to comply with this request to avoid complications. Personally, I considered this to be a fatal decision. The Grand Duke was very popular with the army, with the men as well as the officers. The Supreme Command and the generals at the front would have bowed to his authority. He alone would have been able to save the army from imminent ruin. The provisional government dared not even enter into direct conflict with him. Tsarskoye Selo station was swarming with drunken, disorderly soldiers decorated with red ribbons. They were shouting, fooling around, splitting their sides with laughter, and behaving as though they were conquerors. They jostled the train drivers and climbed into the carriage, and the restaurant car in which I was having lunch. A shock-headed little horror, with a cigarette in his mouth and a red ribbon on his breast, installed himself unceremoniously at the table of a lady dressed as a hospital nurse and began ogling her. The lady repulsed his attempts, and he gave vent to obscene insults. I took him by the scruff of his neck, carried him to the door, and kicked him out, sending him rolling down the corridor. I heard the men muttering, but no one made even a show of defending him against me. The first thing I noticed in Petersburg was the profusion of red ribbon. Everyone was decorated with it, not only soldiers, but students, chauffeurs, cab drivers, middle-class folk, women, children, and many officers. Men of some account, such as old generals and former aides-de-camp to the Tsar, wore it too. I expressed my astonishment to an old comrade of mine at seeing him thus adorned. He tried to laugh it off and said jokingly, "Why, my dear fellow, don't you know that it's the latest fashion?" I considered this ridiculous adornment absolutely useless. Throughout my stay in the capital, I wore the Tsarevich's badge, the distinguishing mark of my old regiment, on my epaulettes, and of course, I wore no red rag, and not a soul ever sought to molest me because of it. The Duma also trembled before the Soviet of the deputies of the soldiers and workmen, and soon let itself be dismissed docilely enough. This faint-heartedness and servile kowtowing to the new power had been apparent from the first, not only among the soldiers, officers, and minor officials, but also in the Tsar's entourage, and even within the ranks of the Imperial family itself. From the very first hour of danger, the Tsar had been abandoned by everyone. During the terrible time which the Tsarina and her children had spent at Tsarskoye Selo, not a member of the Imperial family had gone to their aid. The Grand Duke Cyril Vladimirovich had led the Marines of the Guard to the Duma in person, hastening to present himself to M. Rodzianko. Interviews with him and with Nicholas Mikhailovich appeared in many newspapers, in which they spoke about the Tsar in a vile way. I read these interviews with the utmost indignation. The struggle for power between the Duma and the Soviet of the deputies of the workmen and soldiers still went on. The provisional government, finding that it had no forces with which to fight openly, took more and more to the fatal course of compromise. Gauchkov, the Minister of War, was away. I told his Chancellor's office to advise me when he returned. The next day, they let me know that the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Milyukov, had requested me to call and see him. He received me very politely. I am in constant communication with Gauchkov. I can forward him the letter which you bring and send him a verbatim account of all that you say. He and I belong to different parties, but today we should all be unanimous, should we not? I told him that today iron discipline was more indispensable than ever, that we ought to strengthen and not discredit the authority of the leaders, and that the government's orders were intended to undermine the foundations of the army. In short, I said all that I should have said in my military capacity. He listened to me very attentively and made some notes. You interest me very much, but I will not conceal from you that the information we have received from the representatives of the army does not coincide with what you have just told me, he said. That I can well believe, I replied. But would you be good enough to tell me, sir, to what representatives of the army you are referring? To those who have been elected by nobody but themselves, and today lord it with the Soviet, or to those who stroll about the streets, adorned with red ribbons? In Petersburg now, the only real soldiers are those lying in the hospitals. It is not they, obviously, who have given you your information. I have no doubt that the others I have mentioned hastened to throw in their lot with the revolution as soon as it broke out. Well, since it is not my province, he concluded, I will refrain from expressing an opinion, and Gauchkov is more competent than I to deal with these questions where. In any case, I will inform him of our interview, and when he returns, he will probably see you himself. I found a telegram from General Krimov awaiting me at home. The Minister of War had summoned him to Petersburg, so I was to go back to take his place. When I arrived at Kishinev, Krimov had already left for the capital, taking Samarin, his chief of staff, with him, for he had been appointed chief of the Minister of War's cabinet. He was replaced by Colonel Polkovnikov, who later on, after General Kornilov's rebellion, played such a disastrous part during the days when the provisional government was falling from power. As chief of the divisional staff, he was a good worker and a conscientious officer. We went through bad times. The provisional government continued to lose ground to the Soviet, which soon began to lay down the law to it. The army realized that this was happening and instinctively tried to supply a remedy. A number of regiments informed the government, through their commanders, that they would support it in order to ward off anarchy. All the regiments of our division were of the number. Unfortunately, the government did not know how to take advantage of the proffered help, or did not wish to. Gauchkov, who paid a visit to the army at this time, adopted a very haughty tone, saying that the provisional government was quite strong enough to dispense with all external support, that there had been no division of power, and that the Soviets and the government were acting in complete agreement. Each commanding officer did as he pleased, without consulting his colleagues of the other forces and divisions. Whilst Count Keller refused to swear allegiance to the provisional government and made his troops march past to the strains of the old Imperial hymn when he took leave of them, General Brusilov had himself carried at the head of his troops in an armchair decorated with red ribbons. On March 17th, I went along to a fete which one of my Cossack regiments was holding. This regiment was brave enough in battle, but rotten at heart. As I approached on horseback, I saw that most of the squadrons had replaced their battalion colors with red flags. Passing down the ranks, I noticed that one of these flags was spotted with black and was made out of a skirt such as the peasant women wear. I asked the colonel the meaning of this unseemly farce. "General, the Cossacks ordered it." I replied that in the army the Cossacks had to obey orders and not make them. I saluted the regiment in the usual way, then added, "I came here to drink to the glory of your regiment, under your glorious old flag for which so many brave men have died. But now I have changed my mind. It would disgust me to drink to the health of gallant soldiers beneath the shadow of a red petticoat." And I turned back. I censured the colonel in the general orders. With the connivance of one of the captains with whom I was also dissatisfied, he tried to stir up the officers and Cossacks against me, pretending that because I myself was not a Cossack by birth, I wanted to disparage all those who were. When I heard of this, I dismissed him from his command and ordered him and his partner to leave the division that very day and present themselves behind the lines, where both of them were brought up for trial. Except for this incident, order was maintained throughout the division. General Krimov came back on March 30th. He had been appointed commander of the 3rd Cavalry Corps in place of Count Keller. Since M. Guchkov had been at the War Office, 143 of the higher commanders had been dismissed from the military staff and had been replaced regardless of the custom of promotion by seniority. This proceeding was a very grave mistake. It is true that a number of the higher commanders lacked ability, but the mass changes, the replacing of old generals by men who were unknown to the troops, especially at such a critical moment, had a disastrous effect on the internal order and the fighting power of the army. General Kremov told me of the massacres at Kronstadt, which had put a period to the life of the best officers of the Baltic Fleet. The sailors had assassinated them. Kremov had just seen the new members of the provisional government. Several of them were his friends, and he had regained his courage. According to him, the provisional government was strong enough to make itself master of events, in spite of its appearance of weakness. The members of the government fully realized the necessity for this. They expected to be supported by large sections of society and of the army, but its principal support, according to Kremov, would be the Cossacks. Also, the general had managed to get my Usurian division transferred to this army corps, in place of the gallant 12th Division of regular cavalry. I was far from sharing the hopes he entertained concerning the Cossacks. I had spent part of my youth in the district where the Don Cossacks live. I had gone through the Russo-Japanese War in a Cossack regiment, and had since commanded a regiment, a brigade, and a division of Cossacks. I knew them through and through, and I knew that they could easily become the tool of Cossack political cliques. The separatist tendencies among the Cossacks were a serious danger at this time because Cossack units formed part of many of the regular divisions. I believed that there were other ways of combating disorder, that there was no need to rely on only one section of the army for support, but that we could achieve agreement amongst the command and weld the army into one unit. But I failed to convince General Krimov. He had passionate faith in his new idea. The troops understood it and began to distinguish between Cossack and non-Cossack officers straight away. Several officers who were not Cossack asked to be transferred to other regiments. I told the general that even admitting that I was mistaken, and he right, and I would to God it had been so, we must be consistent and avoid anything which might hinder the success of his plans in the smallest degree, that I, not being a Cossack by birth and having always served in the regular army in peacetime, could not possibly be a suitable colleague for him. General Krimov understood me and did not argue the point. As our appointments had not yet been published, I could obtain another division without any difficulty. The general wrote to the Minister of War to this effect, and on April 5th I left for Petersburg.